So, folks, a huge welcome to everybody here again this evening. As mentioned, this is, I suppose, the next in our series of player education webinars. So, my name is Ailish Ward, and I am head of player development with the LGFA. But more importantly, we are delighted to welcome Fionn Fitzgerald here this evening. I'm sure many of the people that are attending here tonight, or if you're watching back via the recording, you'll probably recognise Fionn as a former Kerry footballer, but we have him on this evening due to his academic and research expertise. So Fionn is currently a lecturer in MTU, but he has previously completed his doctorate in, I suppose, the topic of maturation age effect in underage sports, and that is specifically what tonight's webinar is about. So it's really to focus on the topic of growth and maturation, and I suppose how it applies to our sporting context, particularly in a ladies Gaelic football aspect. But Fionn, I think with no further ado, I'll just hand it over to you and we'll get cracking.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Ailish. Just one small correction. I'd love to be able to say you're right that I have it completed, but I don't. So I still have another probably 6 months or a year to go. So
Nearly there though.
nearly there, yeah, nearly there.
Sorry about that.
What was I going to say? So thanks for the offer or the invitation to present. I've presented a number of different locations around this area in Ireland and across the world at this stage now. But it's always nice to present to different groups. And I suppose the first thing I'll say is that my research was predominantly it ultimately was all in the male context. Based on the cohort I was working with. So I'll explain that a little bit in a second. However, as a lecturer, I have supervised some very similar work in ladies or in the female side of the house in the last year or so. And it's actually very interesting because it's kind of a little bit of a different story. And I think that might resonate with some of the coaches and players and so on here today. So like it can be informal enough. If there's any questions, I won't keep an eye on the question bar. You can pop in Ailish there. So I'll just continue on with my presentation, but certainly at the end I'll answer any of them. And if you want to jump in, Ailish, with any of the questions along the way, certainly do.
No problem.
So I kind of start with this sometimes. It's not gay, it's not in kind of Gaelic terms here or anything, but it's a kind of a nice conversation starter for what the topic is about. Okay, so you might be saying, what am I getting at here? Or what's the significance of this video? I suppose the reality is, in sporting terms, you probably see a lot less of that in senior adult sport than you do at underage level. Both in male and female. Obviously that's a rugby context and obviously a very physical sport, but that type of mismatch is certainly more common in underage sport. And I think a lot of you maybe can relate to that, maybe if you're looking at under 12, 14s, those kind of age groups along the way. One of the big factors there is maturation or maturity, which I'm going to explain a little bit more. So I suppose the first 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to introduce the topic. Obviously going to give you a very, very quick whistle top tour of kind of what the topic is about and what it means as such. And then we're going to discuss some of the research. So in a male context, which is the predominant amount of research I've done, but more recently in female as well. So it's going to be very much based on both, which I think is useful to coaches from both ends. I presented a number of female organizations recently, and they found that they wanted to see a lot of the male stuff as well. So I'm going to present a little bit of both, and we might have a conversation afterwards. And then the last part, I suppose, is the important part for coaches and for everyone, is to understand maybe if we have some of this information and knowledge, what we can do to maybe help influence or impact all players, and what are the practical implications there. So I suppose I start with this kind of topic, and some of these slides are based on the male population, based on the fact that they're they're the cohort I would have looked at. But if you look at, like, even on the left side of the screen there, you have Paddy McBrearty and Ryan McHugh, two Donegal players. That's playing at underage. I think it was around under 13 or 14. Obviously, a huge difference there in size and so on. It's kind of nearly like a men versus boys scenario. But this is them here at senior a couple of years later. So obviously, one player has gone through maturity an awful lot quicker, I suppose, than the other, i.e. Patrick McBrearty. And we've loads of other examples here. I'm sure you can see it yourselves in your local teams, both in a male and female context, any given evening or training session you're at or game. Like another example here, Roy Keane in the middle. He is he's obviously a fairly high profile scenario. There's plenty others. I don't actually have a huge amount of Gaelic examples, but essentially what we're looking at is, I suppose, players who mature or develop at different rates. Okay, so I suppose the significance of that is that in a playing context, such as the video I showed you a minute ago with the rugby scenario, you're probably looking at players who potentially dominate, stand out, and a lot of it at times can be connected with their, I suppose, advanced stage of maturation, or their, I suppose, their higher biological age. In other words, they're a lot more advanced in their physical development, and the advantages that come their way are quite significant. So from a coaching point of view, the kind of scenario I'm putting to you here at the moment is, the players that you maybe highlight or think who are dominating the games at the moment, or who are what I call like Superman or woman, are they ultimately going to be the players that will be in the same position in a couple of years' time? Because some of our research kind of suggests that is not the case. So who you're seeing now at 12 or 13 dominating may not necessarily be the case in a couple of years' time. So just to kind of set the scene as regards two different things, they're probably, I suppose, quite often put into the same conversation and almost thought of as the same thing. So anyone here who is maybe thinking about their son or daughter, or players that they're familiar with and when they're born, so their date of birth, basically, that's very much connected to what we call the relative age effect. So let's say in an annual team under 12 or under 13, the most in general there will be between a player difference in age would be 1 year. I know obviously in a lot of groups you're going to have a couple of ages put together, but let's just say that they're under 12. There'd be a year between a player, and that is significant in an earlier age. So I'm looking at, I have a 3-year-old daughter at home now. I mean, 6 months makes a big difference at that age in preschool and so on. But as they get a little bit older, that kind of tends to, I suppose, what would I say, close a little bit, or that gap, or that significant effect closes a bit. And I suppose a lot of people associate that with being the physical side of it. So in other words, someone's born, in December and someone's born in January, and physically the person born earlier in the year is way bigger, and that's not necessarily the case either. And it can be. Obviously, there's a higher chance, I suppose, if they're born earlier in the year, but there's a lot more at play than that. So the relative age effect is basically connected with your date of birth. Okay, there's nothing you can do about it. It's very black and white. It's the die is cast from your mom or dad. Biological maturity is the one that, and I had researched this previously, rather, and we would have found obviously a bias towards players born earlier in the year. So at undergrad and master's levels, I looked at that, and that's something I'm sure a lot of you are quite familiar with. But it does kind of tend to dissipate a little bit as they grow or go through the age grades. But biological maturity is one where, I suppose, we give the analogy of this. I use bananas, tomatoes as the kind of examples from a fruit point of view, whereby you have players who develop at different rates or stages from a maturity point of view. So the metric that we use, it's called a somatic maturation. I won't get into too sciencey on it, but essentially we use what we call predicted adult height. So when we collect the mom and dad's height, and we get the player's height and weight, we can predict very, very closely, or estimate where they're going to finish up with their final adult height. And I'll explain that a lot better as we go along. That's the measure we use for biological maturity. And I suppose that's very, very significant, because we found that in some of our age grades, let's say under 14 in Kerry, that there can be up to 6 years of a difference between players on the same age group. So they could actually be born the same month, which kind of kicks aside the idea of the relative age effect being a huge problem, and the maturity situation being really, really big. But this is also quite different for boys and girls. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about the differences in boys and girls in a second, but in general, I suppose we're connected with with puberty here. So in other words, when they go through that pubertal growth stage, and for females it normally happens a little bit earlier and than it does for boys. Okay, so they're not the same. You can in fact be born later in the year, but be a lot more biologically mature than someone born earlier in the year. So they're not actually the same. So peak height velocity, kind of a word that some of you may have seen written down, are commonly referred to as PHV. It's basically a fancy word for the growth spurt. Okay, so the best way I'll describe it is this is two kind of players that we use in our PhD study that were basically that were very, very similar in age, give or take a couple of months. But you'll see the guy on the right hand side here. He's what we call an early mature. He's at 99% of his adult height. So in other words, he's finished growing and he's just about 14. And then we have this guy here who hasn't gone through his growth spurt. He's at 89% of his adult height. So we normally say kind of between 85 and 95 is when most growing occurs for a male and a female. And in this side of it, you can even see the difference. Look at the physical difference from a point of view of legs, the muscle mass, and the guy on the right versus this guy here who hasn't gone through puberty. We say even from a weight point of view, there's nearly 30 kgs of a difference, and biologically, age-wise, there's about 3 years of a difference. So this is the kind of information we can get when we collect the players' heights and weights, and we have mom and dad's height as well. So this is really, really useful information for us. So I suppose what is it telling us? It's telling us that one guy hasn't gone through his growth spurt yet, which is the guy on the left, late mature, and this guy on the right has. But the most interesting part of all of this is that they're both going to finish up around the same height. So the guy on the right has basically finished growing, and this guy on the left is now, and I've met him since that was a year and a half, 2 years ago now. He has grown a huge amount in the last maybe year or so. But he was a real small, slight corner forward. Was probably struggling to make the team, really relying on his kind of technical ability, whereas this guy here was probably an awful lot more focused, or his game was built on his physical dominance, I suppose, really. So that's just to kind of give you a context, and I'll touch on a few more case studies like that as we go. But the advantages, obviously, for the early mature here are that, increasing strength, kind of the cardiovascular side of it, his organs, like basically his body he's almost grown up to be a man at that stage. And obviously the idea of his body kind of leveling out and so on. And then self-confidence. So not just the physical side of it, but the psychological aspects of that as well. But his graph is not going to continue to go up, as we can see, from a physical point of view. So this kind of begs the question as regards coaches. Like, everyone will say, oh, the late mature is at a serious disadvantage here. He is, absolutely. But if he can stay playing and stay in the system, for want of a better word, he probably has the best chance going forward. Whereas this guy here, unfortunately, his game might be very focused on being kind of physically dominant and maybe slightly one-dimensional in that scenario. And potentially he's at a disservice in another 2 years' time when everyone else is caught up on him. This is a nice little graph, right? It looks fancy, but all it basically is explaining, it's about 100 players there, and it shows you each one of these lines is what we call the growth spurt. So, for example, on average, a player goes through, and a male goes through it around 13 and a half, 14 years of age. On average, a female goes through it at about 12 and a half. So about 2 years earlier for a female. But what you're seeing here is you're seeing just a range of athletes. This is male now, by the way, but they're all at different levels and stages. So you have one guy here going through it. If my mouse will work for me. You'll have one guy here going through it around is it 10 and a half? So he's really early going through his growth spurt, probably like the video we saw a minute ago. And you have another guy here going through it at nearly 16 years of age. That's what I don't know, the difference of 5-6 years is huge. So you're literally having a kind of scenario there where you're not comparing like this is another nice little kind of way of explaining how it happens differently for males and females. And I suppose an important point to note here is that probably up to maybe 10, 11 years of age, it's very common for boys and girls to train together, play together, at school, club level, etc. But it generally probably does take a little bit of a turn around that 12-year mark. And it's not surprising, because when puberty kicks in, the changes are really, really different for boys and girls. So a lot of what goes on up to then is quite similar. You'll see here 0 to 2 years of age, that's when most growing goes on for a child at the start, and then it tends to level out for both boys and girls. But then you will see around the kind of 11 and a half mark there, females on average, and that's the key point to make, go through the growth spurt there. And keep the on average point in play, because we know with people and individuals, you're not dealing with on average, because you have a range. You have some people who are really early and some people who are really late, and you want to obviously be able to try and cater for everybody. So yeah, these are just to kind of highlight a couple more of the differences, but essentially you're talking about a 2-year difference, and then I'll talk about what actually happens in growth then in a second. So a little bit more growth rate in males and females generally, and obviously the hormones and so on are quite different. So like in a male context, you're talking about a huge increase in the likes of testosterone, whereas on the flip side, in a female context, you're looking at it from the point of view of an increase in estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so like testosterone is going to have a huge increase. It's like basically a human steroid. It's literally like a human steroid, and as a result, it's going to have a huge increase, helping increase muscle mass and so on. Whereas on the flip side, for females, it literally end up going the other way in general, where they're actually more looking at maybe increasing fat mass based on estrogen and progesterone. I suppose also the difference, so like the widening of the hips for females is quite different than it is to males. You're looking at the broadening of the shoulders for males. So the changes are quite different, and I suppose as a result, that has an impact on performance for both male and females. Like some of the ones here were originally in it for males, but like you're potentially looking at this, what we call adult awkwardness. So you see maybe players who stretch quite quickly, or grow quite quickly in a short period of time. And I suppose their bones, muscles, ligaments, everything grows at different rates, and their body hasn't almost caught up to itself. And then as a result, they can actually basic things like jumping, running, kicking, all the basic skills of the game that normally come really easy to them, they can actually regress at them. So it's very common for coaches to see, this player has gone backwards, but maybe you haven't accounted for the fact that maturity and that kind of sudden growth spurt is basically wreaking havoc, really. And so obviously then the physiological changes in heart and there's an increased risk of injury. So we find that I work with a lot of young athletes, and obviously any young athlete I work with at this stage, because it's such a big part of what I've done from a research point of view. I'd measure where they're at from a maturity point of view, and that would help tell the story as regards what type of training we need to do with them, or do we need to modify their training, particularly if they're going through their growth spurt, because there's a lot of stress on the body in that period of time. So this is actually a lovely study. This is done by Megan Hill over in Southampton. So one of my supervisors, Sean Cumming, is probably the leading guy really in this area around the world, and does a lot of the work with some of the Premier League clubs. And he has a number of students working with some of the various different clubs in a similar kind of way. And this study was where they tracked players' maturity for a number of years in the academy. But what this kind of illustrates, they found that this is the type of kind of commentary coaches were saying before a player went through a growth spurt, so that they're nice and normal around 10, 11 years of age. This is for a boy, great mover, great player, losing a little bit of mobility. And then you can see at the top of this curve here is where there's a lot of kind of negative commentary. They're untidy as a player, not striking the ball properly, looking slow, tired, emotional, etc., etc. But if you can remember some of the stuff I just brought up a second ago, this player is obviously in the middle of his growth spurt, so that is having a significant effect. Won't affect every player the same way. It occurs very differently, and it's an individual process. But this is very, very common, and I suppose coaches probably who aren't aware of it, which a lot of them aren't, then it obviously can cloud your view as regards where you think that player is at, and even their potential future in the game, and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden you're seeing on the other end, when it comes out and still in the academy, they're actually starting to see how good the player is again. So it's an interesting kind of commentary there. The main message and the last part on this, before I go into the actual research we've done, is in a lot of cases here, it's literally like some of them are driving a Nissan Micra, and within a couple of months they're moved up to a Ferrari. That's the type of kind of analogy or example I give at times. We had players there in a male context who put on up to 14 kgs in a year, or who grew like excessively, and that's obviously going to have a huge effect. Imagine walking around with that extra weight on your body. For females, they're can be quite body conscious, obviously. So it may be increase in fat mass, and that'll affect them. Potentially, speed is affected for a period of time. And coaches also think that their performance has decreased, but maybe not understanding the full picture or background. So it's a little bit on our research. This is from a male context. I'm going to show the male and I'm going to show the female. So this is with the Kerry and Cork development squads or academies. So we've nearly 250 players there from 14 to 16, like 9 squads. And basically the main message here is that out of 250 players, you'll see here in the kind of green and yellow side, green is early maturing, and then yellow is on time. So in the normal population in the male context here and female as well, you're looking at it being about 15% early, 15% on time, and the rest in between, which is about 70% on time. That's a normal population. Whereas we're finding here that you're talking about the other way around, like 70, 80%, 70% nearly are actually early maturing. So in other words, what it's telling us in a male context is early maturity is having a significant effect on the selection of academy squads. And that's a county level, we'll say. I'm going to show you a club in a second. Essentially, the advantages I've spoken about there are having a significant effect on the selection in sport, or on selection in sport. Okay, so out of all the squads, I think we found only, was it 1 or 2 late maturing players out of 250. So it's a huge skewed bias towards early maturing, right? So that's in a male context. So what's really interesting is we looked at it last year. I had 2 students, Michael Gavin and Aaron O'Sullivan, who I supervised, and they did the same thing in the Kerry female academy squads. And what we found was that it's actually nearly the opposite. So there's actually a bias towards late maturing. Not as strong as it is in the males, but it's certainly not. Look at this here. There's only 3% early maturing in the under 14 squad, whereas we had nearly 70% in the male context. So the trend is almost the opposite. This is also common what we've seen in soccer. There's not a huge amount of research done on this, and it's an area that I think has huge potential, because we all know that it's very different what happens with a male and a female around puberty. And it's interesting now that it's even having an effect on what happens in sport. So like from talking to my supervisor, some of the potential like reasons maybe are, like I said, obviously increase in fat mass has an effect maybe even on a body conscious point of view, from a body conscious point of view. Number 2 would be that coaches' perceptions of their players maybe go down in that period of time. So maybe a player who's considered small, light is quite nimble, and then a player who goes through maturity and body changes, maybe they're not having the same kind of explosiveness at that period of time as their body is adjusting and so on. So there's a number of factors like that that might need to come in, but I don't have the answer at the moment, and we'd be interested to have a chat about that afterwards. This is at club level. This is my local club, Dr. Croaks. We looked at it in a male and a female context, and we wouldn't have had as big numbers on this now. Lorcan Martin from our local club, and he was in UL at the time. He did this study and it gave us a nice picture, but it's telling a similar story, that maybe not as strong as is in the male academy development squad level, but certainly at club level, there's still an early and an on-time bias towards for males. But on the flip side, there's a late maturing bias again for females. So you can see on the right side here, loads of late maturing females, and then very little early maturers there again. So the effect may not be just as strong at club level, but it's certainly there and certainly relevant. So for anyone who thinks it's just a kind of a county problem, it's certainly not. So this is probably a kind of last part of the research to tie in and getting onto the kind of practical side of it then, is that at the start I said relative age when someone is born and maybe the idea of their biological maturity, they're different, they're not the same, and most people confuse at times, oh, my son or daughter is born, later in the year and they're way bigger and so on. That becomes less of an issue, and the bigger problem, I suppose, the size problem, if you want to call it, or the physical aspect, that becomes less of an issue as they get older. But certainly what I would say is this is a good example whereby we had 2 players in the academy. These are males, by the way, but we had them born. The younger guy, who was born in October, is a month older than the guy born in November. but the guy born in November is actually at 100% of his adult height. So in very simple terms, the more physically mature, biologically mature player is actually a month younger. But he was actually 60 kgs heavier than the other player. So literally, like, you're talking about a men v boy scenario there, and you have plenty of mismatches like this in a female context as well. He actually, even though was he 13 and a half, he had a biological age of nearly 18 years of age. So that means he's basically like nearly 6 years more biologically advanced than his other players. So like, it's not right, like, you're not comparing like with like there. I suppose putting them in opposition to one another is certainly not doing justice to either player, I would say, really. So another little caveat to this is then part two of some of our research is we got coaches. We didn't give them any of the maturity information for the players, but we asked them, were they able to estimate whether a player was early, on time, or late maturing? So it was really kind of straightforward, simple enough, and they independently assessed where they thought each player was in their squad. So out of all of those 250 players, I think we had like 18 coaches, because we had 2 coaches from each. Basically, long story short, is coaches are miles off with estimating where players are at. So I suppose most people probably associate at times this kind of idea of come up. So I like to use the iceberg here, as this is the coach's eye, and this is basically what actually the measurement tool that we'll discuss in a second. The idea of getting the players' heights and weights and their parents' heights, that's far more accurate, obviously, than a coach on the sideline saying, "Oh, I think this player is big, so he or she is early maturing," or "I think this player is small and they're late maturing." It's not as simple as big and small, and that's probably one of the mistakes that people make at times, that it's as simple as just bigger or smaller when you're born. Okay, there's a lot more factors to even just genetics than that. Okay. So last little part of it is to kind of, I suppose, explain, well, that's fine. I'm after introducing the topic to you. I'm after hopefully giving you a little bit of insight into maybe some of the information we found at a kind of an Irish or GA context or level. What can we do about it? So the number one part is kind of nearly what you're doing at the moment, is awareness and education. So in other words, like, I have a lot of people from around the country and different sports now, not just in any of the Gaelic sports, but they want to look at fancy ways of working on this, like biobanding, which I'll talk about in a second. But they're lacking the knowledge first. So there has to be a reason as regards you understand the topic a little bit, and then you can layer up what you do with it afterwards from a coaching point of view. There's no point in doing something without knowing what you're doing. So there's no silver bullet answer, but this is the kind of approach we've taken, and by and large, it's worked at times, and other times we've had to tweak how it's gone. So like, this is kind of, it looks a bit mathsy and numbery. I'm not a particularly big statsy man myself, but what it looks like is this is an Excel sheet, and what we basically do is we have created, there's a calculator here whereby we pop in the player's date of birth, the day we assess them, and then their own height and weight, and we've collected their mom and dad's heights already. So they normally fill it out through Google Forms, where they estimate it from home. So that's self-reported height, and you might say, "Oh, is that accurate?" Well, we have a way of manipulating the equation to account for over and underestimation. So in other words, it's part of the picture. The most important part is the height and weight that we collect of the player, but the parents' information is fed into this formula, and then it spits out this information you see on the right side of the screen, which is basically like their predicted adult height, the percentage of where they're at the moment, and then various things like, say, that's their age. Their chronological age is when they're born at the moment. So I'm born in December and I'm whatever age, whereas biological age is actually where I'm at from a biological standpoint, and that's quite important. The percentage of adult height is really important. I'll draw your attention to that again in a few minutes, because that's what we use and how we differentiate at times where they're at in their stage of physical development. So in other words, we spoke about PHV at the start, so that growth spurt. As I said earlier, we know that in general, players that are kind of particularly in the 90 to 95% bracket are going through their growth spurt. Before then, in general, it's like you're building up towards going to your growth spurt. So anyone in red there, they're 93s, 92s, they're hot. They're right in the middle of their growth spurt now. So a lot of them potentially are struggling with performance. Their bodies are changing quite a bit. Movement wise, etc., there can be various issues. Even injuries and so on are a lot more prevalent. Whereas in the green side of it there, that's where they've come out the other end. There's a little bit of growth to go here, but it can almost level out and slow down a bit from there. So they're on the way to almost becoming a full blown adult there. So the interesting thing, I measure a lot of males and females, will be obviously that, like, if I'm getting a 14-year-old boy now, a lot of them are probably like, around these levels. Whereas if I'm getting this at an under 14 girls team, a lot more of the girls are at close to 100% here. So you can nearly start collecting this information a little bit earlier for females because of the fact that they go through their growth spurt earlier. So anyway, that's kind of clunky information. I wouldn't give it to the coaches like this. This is the way I would look at it myself, and then I'd simplify it a little bit better. But this is probably a way of kind of visualizing some of it. So these are two of our under 14 Kerry squad, say Kerry North and Kerry South. But what we have on the left here is our most mature player. That's the guy we saw at the very start. He's at 99% of his adult height, and this guy here at the bottom is at 89%. So they're literally going in order here, as you can see, along the way. And what you have then is the most mature guy at the end. But it's not as simple as saying all the big guys are on the left side of the screen and all the small guys are on the right. Naturally enough, just 2 seconds there now. Sorry, looking for a bottle here. So yeah, like I said, you can see that invariably there is going to be taller players probably on the left side of the screen because they're closer to their adult height, but it's not necessarily going to be as simple as that. So some of these guys here are at maybe not even 90%. So they have a lot of growing to go. So they're going to be actually in maybe 2 years' time. If we went biggest to smallest, or like you're probably looking at some of these guys being over here. So that's useful information for us with coaches because it probably highlights the fact that it's not as simple as just big and small players, or taller and smaller players. So how do we use some of this information? First of all, I suppose on a practical level, we can track their growth rates. So if you're getting this information, let's say you're with a squad for a year, you'd look at measuring certainly once a year, but ideally every maybe 3 to 6 months. And it's really quick. It's done quite easy at this stage. We have it kind of nailed as regards how quick we can do it. And we're really looking for outliers, particularly like if a player is at 90% of their growth at a period of time, we're going to be really keeping an eye on them over the next couple of months, because that's when we know they're going through their peak time. Even their clothes will change. You'll see they're growing out of their shoes quickly. So normally that's what happens. You tend to grow your feet first, and then your body starts, your limbs grow a little bit after that. Modifying training. So I worked with a couple of players last year who were struggling with like knee issues, because I suppose essentially, first of all, you might have pre-growth spurt issues around your ankle, because that's where you kind of grow first down at your feet, and then it expands up towards the likes of your knees and so on. So we'd actually have adapted some of our training with that player, because extra running and so on isn't necessarily going to improve that much. Extra fitness work. I'm saying that in inverted brackets. It's no major advantage to him. This player probably needs a little bit more help and support around movement patterns, around like kind of relearning some of the techniques that possibly were better at previously, but just have gone a little bit astray with this new change in body. And that can be for both a male and a female. Identifying injuries, as I spoke about, and then some of the stuff that I think is more relevant, and I haven't done any in female yet. It's only been trialed in males in more recent times. So I think in the next few years it'd be really interesting to expand this workout into the female game. Is a method of grouping players called biobending. So traditionally, I suppose you group players under 12, under 14, etc. Whereas that's based on your chronological age. Biobending is where we're putting these players together based on their stage of maturity. So if you look at it, this guy is 89%, and this guy is this guy is 99%, and this guy on the right is 89%. So what we're actually doing is we're getting these guys on the right to train together. So like the kind of 92% downwards, and then the kind of 93% upwards. And it's a lot more physically appropriate for those players. So they're working in a more mature environment, be it in training. We looked at it from that point of view, and we actually we've run it in a game scenario as well. So we played like Kerry North and Kerry South under 14s an early maturing game and a less mature game. And it's really, really interesting what we found. This is in a male context, obviously. So like this is a normal game. They would have played themselves maybe a few weeks before we played the bi-banded game. And you'll see, without even knowing, the coaches sent on the teams, but it's not surprising to see that the reds in the middle are generally the more mature players. So the more physically, I suppose, strong players playing in central positions, which I think would resonate with some of you if you're picking your teams and so on. And then obviously some of your less mature players, your 89%ers and 92%ers and so on, are in the corners or the wing positions. So that's just the way it was. They didn't know anything about it. They gave me their teams. Whereas in a maturity context, when we were doing bi-banding then, what we basically did was we were able to mix all these teams. All the reds played against each other and all the yellows played against each other. So it was a way more mature, appropriate environment. And basically both we interviewed coaches and we interviewed players, and they both found it very useful. We call it the less mature players. They loved it because they were getting on the ball a lot more. They were able to take on their players when physically they probably struggled a lot of the time previously. They were also playing in more central positions because they were obviously all on the same team. And previously, the early maturing players would have dominated the central positions. On the other end, the early maturing players found it really difficult because they were now playing in a really physically mature game. It was almost like saying, I've never played in a game this physically as intense previously. And they struggled with maybe taking players on and so on because they were so used to running through kind of and dominating quite easily, and they found it technically a lot harder because they had to rely on their technical skills, which maybe they didn't in normal games. And coaches found it really interesting because there were some players that coaches maybe thought they were ready to discard from the squads, who were maybe in the late maturing context, who really shone, and their confidence particularly grew from that. However, then there was other players who maybe had been dominating, but when they were seen in a different light, in a more mature, appropriate environment, they struggled and they found it an awful lot more difficult. So basically, I suppose some of the key takeaways are that maturity is a huge factor, and there is differences between male and females in that. So on one end, we have the maturity bias towards early maturing in the male context, and in the female context, definitely the other way around insofar as definitely more late maturing in the system and on time as opposed to your early maturing. The different effects of growth spurts. So like I said, it's quite common to see boys and girls playing together up until maybe 10, 11, 12 years of age, that kind of age group maybe. But the changes that occur are significant. So obviously menarche, from a female point of view, has a number of different effects, and I suppose there's certainly an awful lot more research needed in that area as regards what happens from the point of view of peak height velocity in male and females in puberty and so on. It is a transient effect, so particularly in a male context, we've looked at it like it might be a fairly, what's the word I'm looking for, diverse population in the underage kind of context, but when you're getting to like 16 years of age, 17 and so on, it tends to level out a little bit, so that maturity kind of up and down bias or whatever you want to put it, that's really common for a couple of years. But I suppose the problem there is that both male and females are dropping out around these periods or these key ages, and certainly maturity is a factor in some of this, we would think. So maybe monitoring is obviously important, because even a simple thing of tracking height and weight yourself without any parents' information, keeping an eye on if there's any major spurts in growth, then obviously that is something to consider from a coaching point of view. And I suppose looking at like more the longer term side of it, that'd be the big message I would have for coaches of male and females. Even if you're coaching both together, understand that these effects can have a considerable effect on how the players are performing over a short period of time, and as a result, kind of thinking or playing the long game with them, keep an open mind, thinking of it as a kind of a development period, and allowing them to be maybe out the other side before you start casting big judgment calls as regards where they're at and so on. So there's some of my supervisors, Phil Carney and Mark Campbell in UL, and Sean Cumming is in the University of Bath, and he's been an excellent external kind of a supervisor, and I've had huge support from like the whole GA community really across the country, both male, female, particularly in Kerry, locally. So I suppose another area I suppose is that I work in is I have my own youth athletic business, a development business, and I train male and females together. So this is more kind of from a physical development S&C side of it, but you'll see that like it'd be something that we'd be really conscious of is monitoring growth and maturity for them, because so obviously it's a sport. Sorry, in sport it's probably a little bit harder at those ages to combine them all. But I train boys and girls together in this because everyone is working at their own level anyway. They're kind of on their own individual program. So it's actually a very kind of healthy environment where you have two of them working together. And I suppose if you want any ideas from the point of view of, you know, that side of it, conditioning and all, I tend to put up videos and stuff so you can give me a follow on that side of it. And there's another QR code here if you want to take a look at that there. That's where I put up a number of links for some of the work we've done in this area, some articles. There's actually a calculator there as well if you wanted to have a go at looking at your own kids at home or something like that. Okay, so that's kind of me really. I like that kind of quote towards the end about popcorn and how it develops, or sorry, how each kernel pops at their own rate, and that kind of, I suppose, summarizes a lot of what I'm trying to get across in relation to players there, both in a female and male context, is that there's a lot of changes that occur around these ages, and to keep a kind of an open mind and supporting them both, not just your late mature or early mature. Okay, so that's it.
Fionn, thank you very much. I suppose if we just go back to the last slide, just or sorry, no, that's okay. No, if we're off the recording, but guys, if you want to take an opportunity there to use the chat or the Q&A function, just to ask any questions whilst we still have Fionn on the line. Firstly, thank you. I think obviously a huge amount covered there in the last 45 minutes. Really interesting area of research and topic, and you can see, I suppose, how topical it is within both the male and female game. Particularly I think at those levels where you're working at. I know obviously you talked about the academy structures from a GAA perspective, but whether it's under 14, under 16, under 18 teams, I suppose from a ladies perspective, or PDP, that's really, really good. I can see Fionn's away there putting the charger in, but so
Yeah, yeah.
guys, if anybody no, sorry, if anybody does have any questions, but just I see some questions starting to come in there, but Fionn, just on, you obviously talked around the kind of, I suppose it's the focus on technical development, maybe versus that kind of physical dominance. And would there be any advice, say, you know, obviously you've talked about it from a coaching perspective, but say to a player that's maybe, you know, not necessarily aware of obviously this kind of biological maturation, and you know they just see maybe somebody that's a bit bigger than them, a bit faster, a bit stronger getting selected, you know, what would be the focus there then in terms of, I suppose, technical development and trying to come out the other side of this system?
Yeah, so just to kind of summarize, I think what you're asking me is what do you say to players? Is it
Yeah.
what's okay? So it's a good point, and I'll be honest, it's like I've been doing this now maybe 4 years. So if you asked me this a few years ago, like I've learned and we're still learning and we're tweaking kind of, and so I can't say the manual, this is exactly how to do it.
Mm,
But as a general rule of thumb, I would say that it depends on the player. So if you know the player, like if I got to know some of them, like some of them are going to be really soft, gentle kind of people, then you have to obviously, and they might be, you know, low on confidence. You have to try and pitch it to. So let's say in a male context, I'm going to give example. I'm going to give female too. So males, like, some of them I might, let's say someone who's quite behind, from a growth point of view, is that we're like, the great thing here is we can see that you're at, you know, 85%, which basically means you have another 15% of growing to go. So like when some of your friends and peers are actually finished growing nearly, you have a load of growing to go yet. So like, just, you know, play the long game here, understand that, you know, your skill development, your physical development is going to come here now. So don't worry too much a little bit about that. It's all about kind of focusing on you getting better as a player, you know, tactically aware, etc., etc. I don't know if that makes sense. Whereas
Yep.
like an early maturing player, I might even be saying to them early is like, would it be right to say that you're physically you know, quite more advanced than some of your other players in your team? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not going to last forever. And it's important that you know now at under 13 or whatever that ultimately you need to you know, expand your game and realize that
Mm-hmm.
maybe you running through the middle isn't always going to be the case and you dominating at such and such a scenario. So, you know, you're kind of trying to maybe make them aware, but not like done very nice tactful way because you're obviously dealing with
Yeah.
kids. And then in female context, obviously, I would say it's not like you point out to them, and it's something that has come back the odd time is that from a parent is why you're measuring height and weight for like. So with females, I've had no issues because it's like, oh, I'm measuring your height and weight, but like we don't even care about your height and weight. That's not even relevant. We're just looking at your growth and seeing where you're at from the point of view of your kind of overall height. And we would kind of say stuff like from a female point of view, just similar to the males, really, no different. I definitely don't go saying to them that like you're going to have like your fat mass is going to increase and all this kind of stuff. Some of the stuff I've
Yeah.
spoken about to you there.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Sometimes the less, sorry to stand that. Sometimes the less they know. I always try and say it to a way, whether it's an early mature or late mature, and whether it's a male or female, in a way that it's going to be useful information to them. Like I don't bluntly tell them all the stuff I'm knowing that because I actually, do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you can easily blunt someone's confidence, or there's no point in sending them away like not feeling great or anything. But if they're really confident and cocky and they're early maturing, you're probably going to say, well, like that isn't necessarily going to be the case forever. So you just read it kind of as best you can.
Brilliant. Question here. What age are you introducing athletic development from?
Yeah, I see that. Good question,
Yeah.
Declan. So right, that's kind of a how long is a piece of string question, really, because like so just as in my academy there, I deal with from 10 to 18-year-olds, right? But ultimately I just put an age as regards 10 because like you can start athletic development training as early. Like I have a 3-year-old there, you know, I'm messing around playing fun animal movement games or walking around like a monkey or you know trying to roll on the ground like that to me is athletic development. Do you know what I mean? She's jumping off the couch landing on her 2 feet, like that's athletic development in a way but in a very unstructured way. And then a little bit more as they go along, you know, you're talking about your underage clubs maybe where a lot of fundamental movement stuff where you're you know playing games that's athletic development once they're learning to fall, tumble, roll, jump, stand on one leg, you know, all the basic kind of stuff. It doesn't need to be too complicated. But then you can put a little bit more structure in it. So for me, like it's 10 years of age, but still some of them might be very immature then. So I would just get them moving properly, like your basic exercise, your squats, your single leg exercises. So it's kind of a hard question to ask. I'd nearly say like see me in action for 2 months and I'd be able to give you like a kind of a range of athletes. But like the idea of weights being wrong or resistance training being bad at a certain age, that's nonsense. It's all to do with like being stronger and you know being working on speed mechanics, all those kind of things. You just work at it in a very kid friendly way. I don't know, does that answer your question, Declan?
I think it's definitely helped anyway. Thank you. Another question here. When players are more susceptible to injuries, are there certain types of injuries that occur more frequently?
Yeah, good question. Growth related injuries like are probably the ones I should have actually written that in growth related. So like you can get all types of injuries at any stage, but the growth related ones are the ones we're particularly conscious of. So particularly the severs would be quite a common one around the heel before growth spurt because that's just before start your growth spurt because you're tending to their feet will grow first. So anyone who has a child at home now, like and that this growth spurt kicks off quickly, it's normally the shoes they might grow out of first, and then all of a sudden the pants get short and so on. So then they tend to work towards up towards their knees. So Oscar Schladers would be a common enough one, Sinding Larson, some of them you might have heard of. They're kind of growth related knee injuries. And then after that, muscle ones can be, it depends on the sport too. So athletics would be maybe a little bit different to your typical kind of field sports. But in general, like the incidence of injury increases around growth spurt. And the question that might be second part of your question might be, well, what do you do about it? Well, one of the PhD students I was on about followed the players over academy with their maturity side of it over for a couple of years. And then they also tracked injury rates. And they found that obviously players going through their growth spurt, they were, 3 or 4 times more likely to get injured. So what they did during that year, the following season, is they took out one of the training sessions, the normal standard soccer trainings in one of their squads, took out one session a week. So they might train 4 times a week, and they took one of them out of it. And they brought the players going through their growth spurt through extra core work, some more movement quality stuff. So low level stuff, more technical, skill based type of stuff. So the intensity was quite low, but it was very much on restoring movement, etc., etc. And what they found was that the injury rates reduced dramatically. And when I'm working with young players now, and I know they're going through a growth spurt, I've 2 in my mind from last year who are really struggling, a lot of knee issues, and their movement was really poor and all. And I basically was like, look, guys, it's very good. This is normal. You're in the middle of your growth spurt, but like you definitely need to look at maybe some of the training you're doing, modifying a little bit. When you're here in your sessions, I'm not going to do a lot of extra jumping with you because that's going to probably irritate a little bit more. We'll do a lot more work on how you're moving, your control element and all. And now they're absolutely flying it now. And you can even see the difference in their body, like from a puberty point of view as well. So, that's obviously having the information and knowing what's going on.
Brilliant. Um, Guys, if there's any more questions, just type them in the chat there quickly. But other than that, I think I'll just keep a quick eye out. Oh, we do have one. Is there still a sense of disbelief amongst coaches when a girl can complain of an injury at 13, 14 years of age? So, um, I suppose maybe if there are players at that sort of key age group, whether female or male, and they're going through that growth spurt age, and they're maybe more susceptible to injury, are coaches aware of that, or is there disbelief with that?
Yeah, possibly. Like I would say in general, right? So any of my information, I don't know am I answering the question here, Neil, but like any of my um dialogue with coaches, like the likes of this webinars, or I did a lot of interviews with coaches, focus groups and stuff. They were really interested in all this, and it made sense when we chatted about it, but they probably weren't really aware of it, if that makes sense, before then. So I suppose if they don't know about it, which I would say the majority don't, then there is that kind of element of like not knowing and so on. I would think if I'm answering your question right, basically knowledge is power, and knowledge is key. So I'd hope that you're not experts going away today, but it certainly should have you, whether it's females or males you're dealing with, or a combination of both, that you should have maybe a better understanding and cognizant of the fact that, during these age groups, kind of around adolescence, teenage years, that they're really tricky times. And I think that like it'd be really cool longer term to look at stuff like this and connect it with even the likes of your dropout in female sports and male as well. But there's definitely something in it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Fionn, I think that is it for the questions. Just again, a huge thank you, obviously, for presenting tonight. As I said already, a hugely interesting topic, and I think it's relevant to everybody across, our games, whether players, coaches, or people working in other roles. I'm sure it's something that everybody comes across, whether they realize that or not. A huge thank you to everybody else for attending as well. If anybody wants to stay on, has any other questions, just please feel free and we'll try and pick that up. And other than that, whenever you leave, there'll be, as usual, just a little feedback link. So if you can take a couple of minutes to fill that out, that would be great. But we will stop the recording there.